everybody, and welcome. My name is Kirsten, and together with my sister Lynn, we created the Anti-Racist Table, which is a multi-dimensional platform aimed at helping people to bring anti-racism into life as a daily practice. We do this in large part with our free 30-day challenge, which was curated to be engaging, to help educate people, help people wrestle with the difficult emotions that come up in this work, and also provides tools to help people really figure out what does anti-racism mean to them and how can they put it into action. You know, a lot of people are buying books, reading books, issuing statements, putting out banners in front of their house. We're really trying to get people taking the next step so that we can really dismantle anti-Blackness and the systemic racism that has persisted in this country. I have one little quote I just want to read to you from one of our recent participants. Sometimes we ask people why they want to join, and this person said, "I'm learning that not being a racist isn't the same as being anti-racist, and want to take the steps necessary to set an example for my children." So with that, we hope that you will check out our website. We just upgraded our platform, making it much easier to do the challenge, self-pace yourself. You can do it with friends, you can do it in community, you can do it by yourself. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lynn, who's going to do our land acknowledgement.
All right. I just want to check that everyone can hear me because my internet was just unstable. So Kirsten, can you just say yes? Okay, good. All right, awesome. All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Lynn. I'm Kirsten's sister and the other co-founder of the Anti-Racist Table. And I'd like to start this time together with a land acknowledgement that is inspired by Ruth King. She is an African-American mindfulness practitioner that inspires us every day. I would like to call on my ancestors to stand with me as I acknowledge the native custodians of this land. The colonizers named it Washington, D.C. The native land is the Anacostan land, and the people are the Piscataway people. Those people that are named, unnamed, known, unknown, past and present. We honor all traditions and traditional custodians of this region. And we recognize their continued connection to this land, to this water, and to this community. We pay respect to the earth whose generous resources sustain us every day. And we pay respect to the enslaved African people of this land who were brought, held, and sold here, and all of their descendants. And all the people throughout the world that are in captivity, we pay respect to their spiritual labor. And we pay respect to our ancestors whose unwise relationship to race and racism we have inherited. We pay respect to our teachers and our elders, past and present and emerging, and to all of the young people who are teaching us today. We honor this gathering and everyone here, and especially our guest, Michael Steele, for taking the time and energy to be with us today for this important conversation and for this important work. May we recognize that we all share an aspiration for liberation, to be free in heart, mind, and body. Here ends the land acknowledgement. Ashe.
Thank you, Lynn. And with that, I'm going to introduce Michael Steele, who we are very excited to have here today. When he was elected Lieutenant Governor of Maryland in 2003, Michael Steele made history as the first African-American elected to statewide office, and again with his subsequent chairmanship of the Republican National Committee in 2009. As chairman of the RNC, Michael Steele was charged with revitalizing the Republican Party. As Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, Mr. Steele's priorities included reforming the state's minority business enterprise program, improving the quality of Maryland's public education system. He championed the state's historic charter school law, expanding economic development in the state, and fostering cooperation between government and faith-based organizations to help those in need. Mr. Steele's ability as a communicator and commentator has been showcased through his current role as a political analyst for MSNBC. He has appeared on Meet the Press, Face the Nation, HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, and Comedy Central's The Daily Show. In addition to his work in television, Mr. Steele co-hosted the daily radio program Steele Ungar on the POTUS Channel on SiriusXM, and is the host of the podcast, the Michael Steele Podcast. Mr. Steele's writings on law, business, and politics have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, thehill.com, thegrio.com, politico.com, theroot.com, bet.com, townhall.com, the Journal of International Security Affairs, and Catholic University Law Review, among others. He is the author of Right Now, a 12-step program for defeating the Obama administration, which is a call to arms for grassroots America, and co-author of the Recovering Politicians 12-step program to survive crisis. And with that, welcome, Michael. We are thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much for your time and energy today.
It's great to be with you, Kirsten. Absolutely.
Well, we're at quite a moment right now in American history. We've had a summer with a racial reckoning and a real demand for racial equity, racial justice that probably hasn't been seen in modern history. Mm-hmm. We're in this double pandemic. We've had a turbulent election period, followed by the Capitol insurrection just a few weeks ago. And now we've got a new administration in place. But America really seems divided and really at a critical point. What do you think about where we are and where we might be going?
Well, again, it's a real pleasure to be with both of you, Kirsten and Lynn, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. I think from my perspective, one side of my brain goes, well, we've been here before as a nation, but the other side goes, yeah, but we haven't been here like this. And I think that is maybe a fine point that requires a lot of pulling back and getting into, because it really speaks to some fundamentals about what we saw unfold and what we've seen unfold since the beginning of this COVID crisis in the country, and how that initial discussion around how we deal with the pandemic and what responses should we have then sort of opened up the door even before the fatal event of May 25th with the killing of George Floyd and subsequently with Breonna Taylor. It began to put a spotlight on how something like a pandemic, admittedly a healthcare crisis, has a disproportionate impact and effect on communities of color. And a lot of white folks are like, well, what do you mean? We're all having to deal with this. What do you mean? And I think what 2020 was, if nothing else, in answering, or addressing the other side of my head that goes, well, yeah, we've been here before, but not like this, is it's the first time I think a lot of Americans really had their eyes open to what the narrative has been and remains for 401 years. Not just in terms of, the issue of race per se, but how so many aspects and elements of race play into this overarching narrative about America, the American dream, economic advancement and social engagement and appropriations and regentrification and all these things that we're going through, that race is that thread. And I think in a very stark way, COVID sort of exposed that. And then you had the subsequent, damning moments. where the death toll was disproportionate in the Black community, for example, from COVID. And then we're watching for 8 minutes and 46 seconds a Black man have his life snuffed out under the heel of a knee of a police officer. And then this woman in her home late in the evening in bed is killed by the police because they went to the wrong apartment. And all of the narratives sort of came and coalesced and spewed out onto the streets of America. And then white folks were like, well, law and order, started getting mad at the protesting without understanding and appreciating what they were protesting about. And so this was a clarion call for the country, and we're still having to respond to it.
Yeah, and how do you think we're responding right now? I mean, I feel like I've talked to people in the period of time from the summer to probably before the Capitol insurrection who, I think had felt like they had done their part. Like they don't feel like when you talk about the conditions in America that this really applies to them. And they, feel like they've done their part. They've put up their sign. They maybe, if they have an organization, they've put out a statement.
That's the easy part. And that's what we've always done. That's what a lot of folks in multiple communities always do. When these things happen, you'll have a segment that will respond vociferously and with some level of activism. Then you'll have others who will complain and sort of moan about it. And in between all of that, the real justice that's being sought, the real issues that you want addressed, that all kind of gets lost in the shuffle, which is what we saw happen. It was easier to focus on, a group of idiots who decide to take advantage of a peaceful protest and go and start knocking out store windows and burning trash cans. And I note that rarely happened during the daylight hours. It was always in the evening, and they'd show up in the dark of night and they misbehave, and it would tarnish the overarching effort to draw attention to why we're mad and why we're frustrated. So I think the response for me to the question of, well, how are we doing? Okay. It's very nice to see sort of a heightened interest and in sort of an ongoing degree of that. But we still have so much to really get into. We have to, I think, be honest about the tensions that roil around the relationship between white folks and Black folks. And, as I've said in the past, and I think there is truth to it, at the root of all of this is that relationship, because it's endemic to the country. It's in the soil. We stepped onto this soil in 1619, for heaven's sakes, right? So we've been here as long as the white man, all right? And the only ones who've been here longer are, our native brothers and sisters, which I really appreciated the land acknowledgement, particularly in this region of Anacostia, having grown up here in Washington, D.C. And so to understand that tension is important. But what's been the response to that? Oh, well, the 1619 report is a farce. It's a bunch of lies. They're trying to rewrite history. No, they're trying to rewrite history. They're trying to expose the true history. So how are we doing? Okay, just barely. Because even as you make these steps going forward, and even as you have these protests, and yes, it's nice to see, as we saw in the 60s, whites and Blacks linking arms together, as the image on the screen shows, standing there with the signs, the fist in the air. And I was also amused as a sidebar, amused that for some of these rallies, there were more white folks there than Black folks, which I always thought was rather amusing in one sense, ironic in really. But that's fun. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. But you still have this resistance to telling the true history and exposing the true history and the impact of that history. Even in the context of COVID, really understanding why Black men in particular, but the Black community as a whole, is hesitant to take the COVID vaccination because of the history related to vaccinating African Americans with stuff they shouldn't be, injected into their bodies. So it's all of that is how we have to start to peel this back in my respect. So I like the frontline stuff, appreciate it, and all of the hoopla, but it's time to get serious about the discussion. And I don't know if people are really ready for that.
Yeah, truth and truth telling really, really seems like it's at the heart of it. This is a quote from the Southern Poverty Law Center. Researchers studying the far right have sounded the alarm over the threat posed by the rapid proliferation of conspiracy theories, disinformation, and misinformation for years, noting that shifts in the extreme right's mobilization tactics could present new challenges to stemming a tide of violence. And it feels like that's what we saw with the Capitol insurrection.
Mm-hmm.
We see, the Proud Boys. We see just this violence and hate in these extremists. And actually, we had someone on the other day, Professor Liliana Mason, who was talking about some of this. And it doesn't appear that these are actually fringe. This behavior is not necessarily fringe. That there is more pervasive hatred and that kind of feeling in America. Where do you see us?
Yeah, I think the professor's right. It is much more mainstreamed, and it has been mainstreaming itself for quite some time. This is not a one-off. This alignment and realignment has been going on for quite some time, especially in response to the ongoing efforts of the civil rights movement, and relating back to how that movement really kind of crystallized and reset the narrative in the late 50s and 60s. And if you want to just sort of follow it, even going back to the Civil War era, the Reconstruction period, and then of course, which having the compromises made with respect to the rights of Black people during that period, the ushering in of the Jim Crow era, what you see is white supremacy still being the leading thread in all of this. And it sort of does these jumps at various points, and the most prominent jump in modern history was the jump from what, in the political context, from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, and you saw that when Johnson, who was no fan of integration, but did, by virtue of the movement and the moment, adopted President Kennedy's, civil rights agenda, and moved his party and the country leaned into that civil rights agenda. Then you saw the jump by Nixon to sort of pull that pissed off, angry white male Southern vote into the GOP, where it has rested, unfortunately, since the early 60s. And I think that these narratives continue to feed off of each other. And so this idea of this mobilization and the tactics around that really did have its first wave fulfilled, if you will, on January 6th. I hate to say this, but I hope people appreciate it and know it to be true. There's more to come, folks. Mm-hmm. This is not a one-off. Right. They do not threaten lightly. They do not threaten without a reason. And they have made it very clear, as some have for quite some time, they want a race fight. They want a war around race. They want a new civil war. They want to finish the battle that was begun, that they lost in 1865, between 1860 and 1865. And that's what we now have to gird ourselves for, I think. So I think the professors got it exactly right about what's happening. And the Southern Poverty Law Center has, I think, crystallized in this quote really what the narrative is and how it's playing itself out. That's the challenge that we're going to face, because this wave of violence, I think, unfortunately, and I really pray does not occur, but I'm afraid it likely will in many instances. We've seen it at state capitals in Michigan, for example, where they even threatened to kidnap and kill the governor. So there are a lot of elements here to be alerted to and to be worried about. And look, the reality of it is, as reported this week, they're right now in private hands 400 million weapons, 400 million guns. There are only 330 million of us living in this country, and a significant number of them are babies and kids. So you're talking, a nation that is armed to its teeth, some citizens of whom some citizens are itching for a fight to use those very same weapons against their neighbors in their community.
Which I found just so interesting, though, Mr. Steele, because, one thing that Dr. Liliana Mason-Alex also shared with us was that the parties between Democrat and Republican are really not as polarized as it seems that we are, but that there is this kind of hatred that's just driving this difference because of the power of this, social identity, social identity. And that's what's, hard. Like, can we get back to the actual real differences and, deal with those and recognize that, we support a lot of the same things, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, in terms of your policy.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right. And it's a huge frustration for me, who, look, I was a county chairman and state chairman, national chairman, so I can do the political thing all day long. I get the politics, and I understand that. And yeah, you try to play to win, for sure. But there comes a point, and I learned this earlier on in my career, and it sort of manifests itself when I got elected lieutenant governor of Maryland. As I'm standing there and I'm taking the oath of office, a number of things hit me all at once. One was that literally down the hill from where I was being sworn in as the first African-American to be elected statewide in Maryland, Kunta Kinte was brought to the shores of this country as a slave, literally in the Annapolis harbor behind me. And the second thing that struck me from a purely political context, after all the battles I've been in, all the, crazy things that you say when you're trying to get that edge in politics, and you're trying to get that one little bit of momentum, that in this moment, what was required of me as an elected official was not to be a Republican, not to be a Democrat, but to be a leader for the people in the community who's asked me in this time to lead along with our governor, to step into leadership and to set aside those distractions and to focus on how to best make government work for the citizens of Maryland, how best to make our communities stronger, whether it's in the small business area or it's in education and healthcare. I did a lot of work in the criminal justice sector, because I'm sitting there looking at 13-year-old boys, young Black boys out of Baltimore and Prince George's and other parts of the state going to jail. I'm like, what the hell? What's our plan for them? We're just going to let them just let it rot in the system and then curse when they come out at 22 and wind up back in the adult system because we did nothing to care for them and watch for them. So to your point about what we have in common, those are the things we have in common. Those are the things that we're equally concerned about. And we may have different prescriptions on how to solve them. That's fine. But you got to have that conversation. You got to have that level of communication where you appreciate that, Lynn's going to have her approach to solving this crisis in educating children who live in impoverished communities. Michael's going to have a slightly different approach for doing that. But you know what? Their goal is the same. How do we help how to educate kids who live in impoverished communities? So I'd like to see more of that. But our politics now is so damn tribal. It is so us against them. It is so, I had a conversation with two members of Congress right before COVID. One was a Republican and one was a Democrat. And you know what they each told me? It was hysterical. They each told me the same thing, that the minute they crossed the aisle to get support on a piece of legislation from a member from the other side, they get pulled in by their leadership and criticized and chastised for doing that. I'm like, why? Why? So our politics continues to inject that poison into itself. And it makes it harder for us to reach that common goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was going to say that.
Can I ask one more question just about, being part of the Republican Party? How do you feel that there's enough, people like you who, are trying to, be a unifier for the party?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's hard. It really is, because a lot of good people have left. I just wrote an op-ed and I quoted Colin Powell, who said, I just can't be a Republican anymore. And that's hard to hear, because as we know in the political context, that people don't leave their parties. Their parties leave them. Their parties move away from where their values are. Mm-hmm. And so when you have the likes of a Cindy McCain and a Colin Powell and a Condoleezza Rice and these great men and women who have led in the party, and ones who are trying to do so right now, like a Mitt Romney or an Adam Kinzinger or even a Liz Cheney, and yet they get beat back by members of their own team. It tells you just how low and how far gone the cause is. Now, it doesn't mean you stick a fork in it just yet. As I like to say, I consider myself more of a Motel 6 Republican right now. Someone's got to keep the lights on. So, we try to do that as much as we possibly can. But I think those values and those principles and those ideals of how the government should behave and perform, respecting the rights of individuals, giving due power to the states, understanding why we have a checks and balance, meaning the constitutional system being what it is. Those things still matter, because that's how we govern ourselves. We cannot give in to the madness that we've seen over the last 5 years, just because it makes you feel good, or someone sounds like you, or they're preaching to you in a certain way. That's not what this is about, because they could be preaching apostasy. They could be preaching a bad gospel, which I believe Donald Trump did. He preached a bad gospel, and we saw the effects of that gospel on the steps of our Capitol. We've seen the effects of that gospel on the steps of our capitals around the country, state capitals. So I think it's still worth the fight. I just don't know how much longer you can do the fight. And when you look around and the troops are thinning, mm-hmm. and the other side is at least rhetorically getting stronger, and more people are buying into that. So it's hard, but we'll persist as long as we can to make the case and I agree with President Biden, to find that sweet spot of unity. We've got to help the country heal. We need two viable political parties. I'd like to see more, to be honest with you, but these two are what we got. They've got to be mature enough and sophisticated enough to govern. And they've got to get their act together so that they can actually get things done on behalf of people. So we need those voices in the political square to remind them of that. And to the extent that they refuse to listen and they continue to drift away from where America should be headed, then at that point you reassess like others have, and you go, hey, see ya. I'm going to carry this fight on over here and try to keep America on the straight and narrow with these folks because you're doing too much stupid over there.
Yeah, we recently heard about some studies that Henri Tajfel did, which was trying to understand about in-group bias, in-group dynamics. And ultimately, what his findings suggested was that it's all about winning, that the group cares about the group winning over the greater good of the common humanity. And what we have now in that context is these social identifiers, race, ideology, party, and religion, where it's all interconnected. And it seems this is what this quote is about, is really that we're at a point that what research has shown, the Selway has found, that unless you have the cross-cutting identities, you're basically at risk for civil war, because you have people so entrenched in these identities and they're not separate. So you can't separate race from something else. And that it just feels reminiscent of when have we had such division, and it feels like that's where we are now. I know what you're saying, and President Biden is talking about unifying and how can we unify, and that's certainly what we try to do on our platform, is helping people to hear other people and get to know other people and expand outside of their little world and what they know and who they know. Do you have examples, or have you seen things that are working in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, look, I serve on the board of the Bipartisan Policy Center, and we work with members of Congress with our bipartisan caucus to try to identify the legislations, the pieces of legislation that folks can sort of come together around. So you kind of move away from the tribalism a little bit to get something bigger, something more fitting with the greater good. Sort of working at that cross-cutting identity piece that Selway talks about. And their response is there. I mean, and the members are there. The issue is, how do you create the momentum? Quite honestly, that's really what it takes. And that momentum, and let me tell you, for the folks who are watching this and are part of this conversation, I cannot stress enough how important you are in creating the momentum. What's going on right now inside of my party is because a handful of numbnuts have taken a hold of the organizational infrastructure and the messaging, led by Donald Trump, because he had the power and authority of office. If Donald Trump were a governor or a city councilman, would not have near the impact than when you have someone like the President of the United States out here saying, well, when it comes to the Proud Boys and the KKK and Nazism, they're fine people on both sides, right? How you message to people stirs up and creates the momentum. And that momentum right now works against the ideals of this country. So what we need, and why this platform is so important, you're opening up channels of communication which breaks down the noise, right? Exposes the lies, but also exposes the opportunity for unity and singular purpose related to the kind of people we want to be. But what it does also is creates momentum. And that momentum has to be pushed out into the town square, into the public square in a way that it overwhelms what is currently there and pushes back against that. The reason the party leadership has not moved away from Trump and Trumpism is that there's no momentum to do so. There just isn't. And that's why, going back to the point I just made, I would like to see more folks stay with us and fight through this than to leave, because you need to create that momentum. So we're at a point where it goes, okay, even if you leave the GOP, what we need are those forces and those voices, whether they're Democrats, whether they're Republicans, whether they're independents, whether they're Muslim or Christian or Jewish, whether they're white, black, whatever they are, those forces now have to come together to create the momentum to push back. Because if they don't, then the last part of that quote becomes the reality. The alignment of ethnic and religious identities will otherwise speed the onset of civil war. And that's what we face. That's the confrontation. And you can avoid that confrontation with cross-cutting identities, meaning that we're all even though we come together from all the various different perspectives that I just mentioned, we're working towards the same goal. We're creating the same kind of momentum towards something positive, which is why I take to heart what President Biden is saying, and what he's trying to do is trying to realign that energy that's out there, that's much more towards creating those cross-cutting identities unified around us, a purpose, America, so that we don't get settled into this sort of cultural, ethnic, and religious identities where it's all tribalized and it's us versus them.
Yeah, and I just love also how he's just like turning down the heat, and just turning the volume down, trying to create a little bit of healing and, coming together. And this is
right.
kind of, we haven't seen that in so long. I can tell you at the inauguration, I felt like, oh my God, we can finally breathe again. I feel like
I heard a lot of people say that, but I heard a lot of people say that.
It felt like there was just
myself included.
For 4 years. Like, oh God, like what is he going to do with us? We're getting on a ride that we didn't want to go on. Now,
right.
Okay, we have a little bit of breathing space, even though there's so much to do. I feel like at least we're pointing, steering the boat in the right direction, but
right.
And I don't know, but
I think though that with that, sigh of relief, it's people really need to be reminded and to understand that just what you were just saying, Michael, that we're still at a critical point, and that just because we have Biden here does not mean now you get to step away and everything's fine. That actually this is the time really to step up, just for all the reasons that you were saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, you explained it so clearly.
No, it's critically important. I tell people, just to put it in street terms, don't get punked. Mm-hmm. Don't get punked by the system the way it is right now, because on one side, going back to how we began the conversation, you can believe it's just enough to ink out a sign and go stand and wave it for 2 hours, then go home. Mm-hmm. Or you can get punked thinking that, we're going to go take our government back and we're going to go storm the Capitol. Neither of those solve the problem. Mm-hmm. And so you really do have to fully engage and have an honest conversation with yourself first, because that then just makes the honesty that much easier when you have the conversation with someone else, and acknowledge, to yourself, how you feel about all of this. Do you feel threatened by the fact that, Blacks and Hispanics and women and LGBTQ and others are now much more part of this culture and this society, and they are having an impact on this culture and the society? I mean, you can go back, ladies, and you can see this was foretold. Mm-hmm. I mean, just go back into the Obama years. I mean, I can go back further into the Bush years on sort of international with the whole war in Iraq and a lot of the issues that were born out of that on a global scale. Then you've got the environmental narratives that we found ourselves that we can't even agree that it's too hot. And why it's too hot, right? Why is it hotter now than it was 100 years ago? And, we'll be even hotter still 100 years from now if we don't do something. And what that will impact it'll have on our environment. But then you also look at the sort of the cultural changes that have occurred. All of a sudden you wake up one morning and you know, gay and lesbian individuals are marrying each other. How the hell did that happen? You know, Martha, I went to bed last night and what do you mean? You know, and because they never really wanted to reckon with with themselves or reconcile with themselves that they had a gay son or a gay grandchild. And all of a sudden now all of that is having to come back and they got to deal with it. And they're like, I don't want to deal with that. So the culture's changing. It's leaving me behind, you know, and all of a sudden you become a victim. So folks like the Trumpist community, you know, all of those folks who sort of play into that narrative, they cut at those wounds and they keep reopening them and they keep and reminding you, and they never allowed to heal. You're never allowed to reckon with that and come to peaceful terms with the fact that you have a gay son or a gay daughter, or that, guess what? There's a Black family that's just moved into the suburbs, right? Even though Blacks have been living in the suburbs forever, you know, but it's how we reconcile and come to that truth. And we have always found a way in our history, sometimes torturous, but never like this, where it's led to violence like we see. But we've always found a way to reckon with that. And that's the struggle going forward. How do we reconcile? How do we come to reckon with all of this?
Yeah, it seems like it all, you know, comes back to truth and truth telling, and America has this narrative of what it is, and
Yes.
people don't want to let go of that narrative, even though.
Can I just jump on that real quick?
Yes, please.
Because you just made, stick a pin in it comment you just made about the narrative. Because can I just put on the record, the narrative America is not white. All right. And why do I say that? Because Black folks helped build it. Right. So you can't separate that out. You can't act like 1619 didn't happen. You cannot act like, the reason we have this beautiful building called the US Capitol and this wonderful home over here for our presidents is because who built that? You know, the fact that we have a street light, stoplights, who invented the stoplight? The fact that when you go to a hospital and have a blood transfusion to save your life, who created that? You know, so that integration of truth is so important in coming to and appreciate what the real narrative of America is. And it's not just white. And that's what a lot of people like to pretend it is, but it isn't. And its future is even less so. It is multiracial. It has always been that way. Even given that when, you know, the Hispanic communities that came, that controlled great portions of this country for a long time, you know, the Asian community that came here, certainly African American. So it's not just this white narrative. And that's really what this is about. Who gets to tell the story of America, and what do they tell about that story?
And finally, the anti-Blackness narrative of, you know, the dehumanization of the Black man and Black woman, just to really get to, you know, expose that to young kids and to, you know, people who grew up with that as children, who still live with that kind of mentality, feeling that, you know, they are superior as adults. They're teaching the next generation to believe that. We have got to, you know, make changes in the school systems and really tell that true narrative and make space for the other cultures who, you know, were brought here without their own, you know, willingness. They were forced here to do this work and create this empire for this country. And, you know, we need to have some atonement for that.
We do. And acknowledge how all of this has been not just created, but sustained. Right. But even beyond sustaining it, how how these various communities have brought so much flavor to it and so much fun, joy, and excitement, and their own pain and their own struggles, irrespective of the repression of racism. But just, like everybody else, having to deal with, making one end meet the other and raising families and kids. That narrative is the same for Black folks as it is for white folks, right? White folks don't have a monopoly on the struggles of raising children, but what they have to recognize is that in addition to that same struggle that they have, there's another layer on top of it for a brother or sister who has to have a conversation with their children about, now, when you go out, just remember, when you get stopped by the police or when you're hanging out with your friends and something happens, right? You're the one that they're going to come to first as look at as, maybe the reason why that bad thing happened. So that next level of appreciation in the story has to be told. And I don't give a damn whether you want to hear it or like to hear it or not, but you're going to hear it. We have to tell that story. And I think it's incumbent on us, which is what I think, going back to how we began the conversation, why that narrative around Black Lives Matter, and we've seen how it changed just in 5 years, right? From taking a knee and oh my God, to, hey, I'm standing with you, right? Why that narrative is so important to tell it. Because when you tell it, whether people want to hear it or not, they hear it. They hear it. And they realize so much more about their own behavior, and about how they respond to, and how they should respond to it. But it's important for us, it's cathartic for us to tell that story, which is why, regardless of what you may want to think of the 1619 Project and the work, or any other effort that's been out there to sort of tell that story, it's got to be told.
Yeah. Agreed. It's got to be told. And like in Germany, the kids learn in school about the Holocaust. All throughout the country, there are monuments to the victims. Unlike here, where it's to the Confederates.
We put the right.
They lost, but they're revered, and they've got monuments, and And that's the story we have to change. Yes. Which brings us back to the racial reckoning, and the impact that it had, and the impact that it's having. And where do you think that is? Well, I think both those questions have not been fully answered yet, because we don't know the full impact that it may have had. And when you look around now, it's hard to tell whether it's really having an impact, because we're not engaged in that conversation right now. Right. And all of the protests and all of the marching, all that's kind of died down, and people have kind of retreated back to their homes. And so again, that's why a platform like this is important, because you can try to assess what impact may have been, and then push in front of us the conversation so that it can have an impact going forward. So I think that there's the jury's still out a lot, not just a bit, but a lot on that. And it is an ongoing work in progress for all of us. The racial reckoning begins with yourself by being honest about how you feel about race. It's look at the mirror and go, I just don't like white people. Yeah. Or look in the mirror and go, you know what? Can't stand those Black folks. That's where the reckoning has to start, because to your earlier point, or your point just down about, how it's pushed out and how it's taught and all of that. That's how you break that cycle. Right. Those young white boys that showed up in Charlottesville in their neatly pressed khakis and their finely pressed shirts and their jackets and their sweaters over their shoulder, with their little tiki torches, we're saying death to Jews. Yeah. And so no matter how you dress it up,
You have to understand what the words are and what they're saying and what they mean. Yeah, they're not wearing a hood because they don't have to. You know, we now have our racism out in plain sight. It's not covered by a hood anymore, because what they're saying is, I dare you to do something about this, because you can't. You know why you can't? Because I'm the neighbor, I'm the family member, I'm the the successful CEO, I'm the newly elected politician, right? You didn't know that, because I've got the way it's masked and the way it's shared and spread out. Doesn't seem as bad as if I showed up with stuck a cross in your lawn and set it on fire. So we have to understand what we're looking at. We have to understand how it's being presented and why it's so much easier now to teach that behavior and to learn that behavior, which goes back to what I was saying about resisting and creating momentum against it. Because if you don't, it reminds me just real quick of a friend of mine. This is in the mid 80s. This is such a great story. And I love her for every time I get to tell it and share it. She was in DuPont Circle here in Washington, D.C., and took her baby, her son, her 2-year-old at the time, 3-year-old son, to DuPont Circle, sitting on the bench, middle of the day. And there was this little white boy who was already there, was playing. So her son went to go, as children do, right? Because, hey, there's another kid and he's got a truck, right? And so her boy goes over and the kids start playing, right? They start playing. Well, the mother of the little white boy comes up, snatches her child up, and said to her son out loud, I told you I didn't want you playing with them. So my friend watching this, hearing this, she stands up, goes to her son, right? Gets her son, turns around and smacks the crap out of that woman. Just hauled off and slapped her and looked at her and said, how dare you teach your son to be a racist? And she took her son and walked away. That's the moment. That's the momentum. When you push back against that. Now, clearly, that woman didn't think that she would get her behind smacked for that. And she was too stunned to even probably call the police and claim assault. And of course, my friend at that moment realized what she'd done, hauled ass the other way. She's like, okay, let me just go home now before the cops show up. Oh my word. But I love that story because that's the resistance. And it's also reminding us that this is a learned behavior. It is taught. Our kids aren't taught to hate each other. Our kids aren't taught to hate each other because your skin is darker than mine, or whiter than mine, or your hair is different from mine, or you sound different from me. For a child, that's curiosity. For a child, that's something they want to lean into, not run away from. But it is our stupid parents who teach them otherwise. And that's the fight.
Yeah, well, I have to say, this is so interesting. I was looking at my daily insight from the Dalai Lama, my little meditations every morning, and it says, this is for today, our inner lives are something we ignore at our own peril. And many of the problems that we face in today's world are the result of such neglect. So that's the thing. We have to do the inner work. We have to get to the root of what our issues are that keep us, in this state of hate, in this state of disconnect from the other. Yeah. That's really at the root of it. If we can really see each other in the common humanity that we share, then maybe we'll be in a different place. This is really the call of our time.
Yeah, it is. It really is.
And I think as your point, Michael, is that it's a verb, anti-racism, democracy, it's action. We have to show up, we have to teach, we have to lead by example. So we're almost right at the end of our time. We wanted to highlight that, you obviously know this is the first time we
have a question from the audience.
Oh, okay.
Question. We do want to try
Sorry.
to get questions.
What kind of reparations or policies to correct past wrongs can be adopted that have any kind of political viability?
That's an important question, and it's one that we're going to have to struggle with along the way, because everyone has a very different view about the issue of reparations. What does it mean? And of course, everybody goes, well, what's it going to cost? The reality of it is, to be truthful, you really can't put a dollar figure on what African-American contribution has been to the United States of America. But yeah, some try, and some, maybe one day we do, but I think it's beyond that. I think it's beyond that sort of, here's a check, because that's easy to do. I give you a check and I don't have to think about you anymore. Well, I gave you money. What the hell are you complaining about? We just gave you X trillions of dollars, whatever. What I think the ultimate reparation is, we are sorry as hell. I'm sorry. On behalf of the United States of America, I'm sorry for what we've done, what we did, and what we continue to do. And that begins the healing. Because the check is not going to, if we can go buy a TV or get a new car or whatever they're going to do with it, that's fine. But you're still Black in America, right? And white folks still may have that attitude about Black folks. The reparation begins when the country says to the community, we're sorry. Now, we've apologized to a hell of a lot of other people around the globe. We haven't apologized to Black folks. Yeah. And I think that for a lot of African Americans is the turning point, where you begin to come into, square that circle and really kind of get to that point where we're seeing all the corners. We're seeing it all now. And everybody is acknowledging the one thing that needs to be acknowledged. We were wrong.
Well, what do you think about just doing some kind of reparations for all of the white affirmative action that this country was built on? That there needs to be something to develop wealth for Black people, and to also, support Black communities with, funding for education and,
Yeah, I think, that's always, I think a lot of people would rightly argue there are any number of programs and the like that are already in place to do that. I know what I did and tried to do as Lieutenant Governor in Maryland with respect to creating a stable platform on which African-American businesses can launch their enterprises with a higher degree of success than they've seen in the past. And there are ways to do that, and they should be done. But it's going to be state to state, because every state's going to be different. There's going to be dynamics. President Biden has come out with his efforts to sort of call attention to racial equity across the federal government. And we'll see what that ultimately looks like, how that's going to ultimately play out. So those things are tangible, and they are important, and they can be done. But even with that form of reparation, if you will, where we've now sort of leveled the playing field, there still has to be that acknowledgement of the wrong. Because it's almost like the pardon game that we just saw with President Trump, giving pardons to people for what? What'd you do wrong? Mm-hmm. What'd you do wrong? Well, you just pardoned these guys over here. What did they do? Why? So you've got to acknowledge, when you make that kind of commitment, you make that kind of act, it's got to come with an acknowledgement of truth. And I think that you still need that piece as a part of this effort. Now, if Joe Biden comes out, on the heel of all of this executive order on advancing racial equity, et cetera, and all those programs, and in the midst of that, looks at the country and go, on behalf of the United States of America, I just want to say to the African American community, we were wrong. We're sorry. And we will never allow it to happen again. That changes the way this conversation is going to end ultimately. And I think it ends in a very good way, but we'll see.
Yeah, we have to have that apology.
Well, we would invite people to check out our reparations petition on our website, which calls for robust reparations, and it has links to proposals from experts and thought leaders who have really spent a lot of time, and it includes an apology and atonement, but also education and the multitude of things to try to eliminate the wealth gap and to really reckon with anti-Blackness and its legacy. And with that, we are out of time, and we just thank you so much. We want to tell people we have Dr. Peggy McIntosh coming up next month, and a bunch of other events that we will have up on our website. We want to thank Michael Steele for joining us. And Michael, if you want to give out your website, or what's the best way, your handle, people to follow you.
Yep, absolutely. You can follow me on Twitter at Michael Steele, and that's Steele with an E on the end. And you can check out my website where we've got a lot of information and writings that I've done and videos. And that's at the Michael Steele Network, Michael Steele Network, and .com, and check it out. And again, thank you guys so much for this conversation. It was really refreshing, and hopefully I was able to contribute something to it.
It was awesome. Thank you so much for being with us, Mr. Steele.
Thank you.
We'll do it again. Take care of yourself, and we'll see you on MSNBC.
Yes, I'm getting ready for that now.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, guys, take care. Bye-bye now.
Okay, bye.